Hello everyone, and welcome back to Observer X. I'm the voice guiding you through the parts of our world most people overlook, the hidden stories, the forgotten histories, and the human experiences that stretch far beyond what most of us could ever imagine. If you're someone who loves diving into the strange, the shocking, and the profoundly human, then you're definitely in the right place. Today's topic is something both haunting and strangely fascinating: people who outlived extremely long prison sentences. Sentences so overwhelming in length that they consumed entire lifetimes. These are individuals who stepped into prison as one kind of person and emerged decades later into an entirely different world, a world that no longer resembled the place they once knew. Some of them were hardened criminals. Some were teenagers who committed terrible acts. Others were victims of injustice, swallowed alive by a system that failed them. Their stories raise questions about time, justice, humanity, and the psychological toll of spending nearly an entire life in confinement. So today, I invite you to travel with me through time, decades at a time, as we follow the lives of 10 individuals who walked out of prison after serving sentences that seem almost impossible to fathom. Let's begin. Our first story is about Eddie Collins, a man who spent 43 years behind bars. Eddie grew up in a rough part of Tucson, surrounded by influences and circumstances that shape a lot of young people in ways they don't fully understand until it's too late. At the age of 21, during what should have been a simple drug buy with his younger brother, things escalated into a heated confrontation. A weapon was drawn, a fatal shot was fired, and in a single instant, Eddie's life changed forever. He admitted it, regretted it, and lived with the consequences for the next 4 decades. In interviews, he often looked down, speaking quietly about the immense remorse he carried. While other young men were learning trades, building families, and shaping careers, Eddie was watching the seasons turn through bars and glass, marking the passage of time by the sound of doors clanging shut. 43 years is long enough for the world to change its fashion, its technology, its culture, its entire identity. When Eddie saw all of that change from the sidelines, waiting, watching, aging. The story of Otis Johnson, however, is even more striking in terms of the world he stepped back into. Otis was 25 when he went to prison for attempting to murder a police officer. It was the early 1970s. A world of rotary phones, payphones on street corners, film cameras, vinyl records, and handwritten letters. A world without the internet, without social media, without the global digital highway that defines modern life. 44 years later, when Otis walked out at the age of 69, the world had transformed into something almost alien. Imagine being frozen in time while society accelerates around you, leaping forward into an age of smartphones, streaming platforms, self-scanning grocery stores, digital payments, facial recognition transit systems, and people who walk down the street talking to themselves through wireless earbuds. For Otis, stepping into this modern setting was overwhelming. He watched people staring at the glowing screens in their hands and thought they were spies. He saw subway systems that no longer accepted tokens. He saw crowds that moved faster than he could mentally process. He had lost almost all contact with his family decades earlier. So when he was released, he had no one waiting for him, no home to return to, no job prospects, no support system to lean on. The $40 he received upon release didn't even cover a week's worth of meals. So Otis entered the modern world not as a newly freed man, but as a stranger in a time he could not understand. Then we come to one of the most notorious figures on this list. John Sonny Franzese. If you've studied organized crime, his name might ring a bell. Franzese was not just a criminal. He was a mafia underboss, a man who lived in the shadows of power, fear, and violence. Throughout his life, he boasted that he had personally killed more than 60 people, though the true number will probably never be known. Franzese went into prison already carrying a lifetime of infamy. But what makes his story most astonishing is the age at which he came out. 100 years old. Yes, 100. He had spent 50 years of his life behind bars across multiple stints. Think about that, half a century. By the time he was released, the mafia world he once ruled to collapse. His allies were long gone, his enemies too. He returned not as a feared mobster, but as an elderly man who needed help walking. And yet, the strangest part of his story is that he outlived almost everyone in his criminal circle. Time, in the end, spared him far longer than it spared many of the innocent people who crossed his path. While Franzese's life is drenched in crime and violence, the story of Harvey Stewart is one defined more by solitude than infamy. Harvey spent 60 years in prison, 6 decades, during which the world outside changed so dramatically that stepping back into it must have felt like entering a different universe entirely. When Harvey entered prison, John F. Kennedy was president. Cars were simple, mechanical machines. The Beatles had just released their first single. Computers were massive, room-sized devices used only by scientists. Television had only a handful of channels. Most people still wrote letters instead of emails. People went outside without carrying any electronics at all. When Harvey walked out in 2011 at the age of 83, everything had changed. Cars were equipped with navigation screens. Phones had become miniature computers. Music existed in invisible digital libraries. People communicated through apps instead of voice. Drones flew in the sky. The entire world was connected in ways Harvey could not have imagined. Even worse, Harvey had become a forgotten man. He had not received visitors for decades. Relatives, friends, acquaintances, every connection had dissolved during the long stretch of time he spent behind bars. Imagine emerging from prison and realizing that every person you had ever known has either passed away or moved on without you. That is the loneliness Harvey stepped into. A world that no longer knew his name. The life of Hugh Alderman adds another layer to this exploration. Hugh was only 23 when he joined a four-man gang to rob a bank. The robbery went wrong, and Hugh emerged as the only survivor. Instead of simply serving his time, he tried to escape. Not once, but twice. In 1919 and 1924, he actually managed to break free, but each time, freedom was temporary. Eventually, he was moved from prison to a mental institution, where he spent the final years of his life. He had stolen $6,000 in 1917, a significant sum then, equivalent to over $100,000 today. But the price he paid was far greater than any monetary value. His life was effectively consumed by the consequences of that one decision. Instead of building a family, a career, or a future, Hugh spent more than 6 decades confined, isolated, and ultimately forgotten. Next is perhaps the most heartbreaking case on the entire list, Charles Everett Ford. Charles spent 64 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. Let me repeat that. 64 years. Innocent. In the 1950s, Charles, a young black man, was put on trial before an all-white jury at a time when racial discrimination was not just common, it was embedded into the legal and social structure. He had little chance of fair representation, and he was convicted of murder based on a system that viewed him not as a human being, but as a stereotype. He entered prison at the age of 20. He left at age 86. By the time he was finally released, the physical world had changed beyond recognition, and Charles himself had grown old, frail, and tired. He spent his last years in a nursing facility, reflecting on a life that had been stolen from him. There are few tragedies greater than time wrongfully taken, time that can never be returned. Also, the next individual, Howard Christensen, entered prison at the age of 16 for murdering a teacher, along with a 17-year-old accomplice. The crime was serious and devastating, and the punishment reflected that gravity. Howard was sentenced to life without parole, and his accomplice eventually took his own life just 6 years into the sentence. However, remained inside. After 30 years, his sentence was changed from life without parole to a staggering 200 years, effectively ensuring that he would die in prison. Yet, in 2001, after 64 years, Howard was unexpectedly released. Unfortunately, he didn't have much time left. He lived only 2 more years before passing away. 2 years of freedom, after nearly an entire lifetime in confinement. It's difficult to imagine what those final years must have felt like. Relief, confusion, sadness, maybe all at once. Richard Honig's story provides a different perspective. At 22, he murdered a former school friend and received a life sentence. While many people assume a life sentence means one specific length, in reality it varies widely depending on the location and era. For Richard, life meant exactly what it sounded like, decades behind bars. He served 63 years and 1 month before finally receiving parole. He walked out at 85 years old and managed to live another 12 years. In the end, he reached the age of 97, surviving nearly everyone from his early life. It's strange to think that someone could spend most of their existence in prison and still find a way to create a small chapter of freedom at the end. Richard managed to do just that. Then we arrive at the unusual case of Johnson Van Dyke Grigsby, a man who spent 66 years in prison after being convicted of murder in 1908. Over the years, he was denied parole an incredible 33 times. Think about that. 33 rejections. 33 times he prepared himself for potential freedom, only to be told he would remain behind bars. Finally, at 89, he was released. But the world he stepped into was not the world he once knew. Like several others, He discovered that adapting to modern society after such a long confinement was nearly impossible. Jobs were hard to find, routines were hard to adopt, and the pace of life was overwhelming. For Johnson, prison had become a structured environment where he understood the rules, and outside he felt lost. So lost, in fact, that he returned to prison voluntarily and stayed for 2 more years before leaving permanently. He died at the age of 101. And finally we come to the man who served the longest confirmed prison sentence in American history, Paul Geidel Jr. His story is staggering. Paul was only 17 when he was convicted of second-degree murder in 1911. He entered prison as a teenager, when technology was primitive, when streets were lit by gas lamps, when people still traveled by horse-drawn carriages in some places. He served 68 years, nearly 7 decades. When Paul was granted parole at the age of 86, he didn't want to leave. Prison was not just a place. It had become his entire world. He had spent more time there than outside it. He didn't know how society worked anymore. The noises, the technology, the expectations, it all frightened him. So he requested privacy, asked not to be thrust into public attention, and simply tried to live quietly. He spent his final years in the nursing home and died at 93. Out of his 93 years, only 24 had been spent in freedom. The rest had been swallowed by incarceration. What ties all these stories together is not just the length of the sentences. It's the transformation of the world outside. These men entered prison in one era and emerged in another. They watched entire technological revolutions unfold from inside a place stuck in the past. They lost families, relationships, dreams. Their identities were reshaped by a system designed to punish, not rehabilitate. Time is something we all experience, but very few people experience it the way these individuals did. Decades in solitude. Decades away from society. Decades without choice. Time becomes heavier in those conditions. More suffocating. More unforgiving. Some of these people were undeniably guilty. Some were young, reckless, and violent. But others were caught in systems that failed them, judged in eras that lacked fairness, sentenced by biases that shaped their destinies before they even spoke a word in their defense. When they finally stepped outside again, many of them were not stepping into freedom. They were stepping into a future that felt impossible to navigate. Some managed to adapt. Some never did. Some had no one left to help them. Others had become strangers to their own identities. These stories remind us that prison is not just a building. It's a time capsule. A place where the world freezes for you while everything else continues without you. And once you emerge, you are forced to face a world that doesn't slow down, doesn't make exceptions, and doesn't offer a pause button so you can catch up. If you found today's exploration thought-provoking or eye-opening, don't forget to subscribe to Observer X. There are many more stories waiting, stories about human nature, history, mysteries, and the strange truths that shape our existence. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay aware, and above all, stay observant.